I was packing my personal items into a cardboard box when Principal Morrison walked into my empty classroom one last time. The smell of whiteboard cleaner and old books filled the air as I carefully wrapped my favorite coffee mug, the one that said "World's Best Teacher," that my students had given me 3 Christmases ago. "Sarah, you don't have to do this so quickly," she said, though her voice lacked any real conviction. "You could appeal the district's decision." I looked up from the box containing 22 years of my teaching career. Photos of former students, handwritten thank you notes, classroom decorations I'd bought with my own money, and stacks of essays that would never be returned to their young authors. Appeal? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. For what? For showing compassion to a traumatized child, for giving a hug when a 16-year-old girl was sobbing about her mother's cancer diagnosis. Morrison shifted uncomfortably by the door, her eyes avoiding the bare walls where my motivational posters used to hang. 24 hours ago, this classroom had been alive with learning. Student artwork covered the bulletin boards. Bookshelves overflowed with novels and poetry collections, and the walls displayed the creative writing achievements of hundreds of teenagers who discovered their voices within these 4 walls. Now it looked like a crime scene. "The policy is clear," Morrison said quietly. "No physical contact with students. Zero tolerance." "Zero tolerance," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words. Even when a child is breaking down? Even when basic human compassion demands action? What I didn't know was that in 72 hours, my life would change completely because of that hug. Because the crying girl I'd comforted, Dima, Chun, had a father who would soon prove that sometimes the most powerful revenge comes from the most unexpected places. Because Richard Chun wasn't just any parent, he was a billionaire who believed teachers like me were worth their weight in gold. Let me give you the full picture of how I ended up in this nightmare. I'm Sarah Thompson, and I've been teaching high school English at Riverside Preparatory Academy since 2002. At 45, I thought I'd seen every type of educational crisis, from helicopter parents demanding grade changes to administrators more concerned with liability than learning. Riverside Prep was what you'd call an elite private school. Tuition ran $45,000 per year, and most of our students came from families where that amount was pocket change. The campus looked like a small college, with manicured lawns, state-of-the-art technology, and facilities that public schools could only dream about. But beneath the polished exterior, Riverside had become increasingly corporate and cold. Over the past 5 years, our new headmaster, Dr. Frederick Blackwell, had implemented what he called professional protocols that were really just ways to eliminate any lawsuit risks. No touching students, no being alone with a student behind closed doors, no personal conversations that weren't directly related to academic content. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were supposed to be educators, people who guide and nurture young minds, but we were treated like potential predators who needed constant monitoring. My classroom was in Hamilton Hall, a brick building that smelled like old books and fresh paint from the constant renovations wealthy parents funded. Room 212 had been my sanctuary for over 2 decades, where I'd taught everything from Shakespeare to slam poetry, watching shy students find their confidence through creative writing and debate. The walls told the story of my career, letters from former students who'd gone on to become published authors, journalists, and teachers themselves, photos from school plays I directed, debate tournaments we'd won, and creative writing contests where my students had earned recognition. A framed article from the local newspaper calling me Teacher of the Year 3 years running. But more than accolades, I was proud of the relationships I'd built. Students knew they could come to me when they were struggling not just with essays and grammar, but with life. I've talked kids through their parents' divorces, college rejections, and first heartbreaks. I'd written recommendation letters that helped students get into their dream schools and given pep talks before big presentations. That was before Dr. Blackwell's reforms turned teaching into a corporate transaction. The changes at Riverside had been gradual but systematic. Dr. Blackwell arrived 5 years ago, with an MBA from Wharton and 0 classroom experience. His background was in corporate risk management, and he treated our school like a business where students were customers and teachers were service providers who needed strict oversight. The first policy change was the no physical contact rule. No high fives, no pats on the back, no consoling hugs when students were upset, Everything had to be documented. Every conversation with the student required a witness or an open door. Even congratulating a student with a handshake was discouraged. Liability issues. Blackwell explained during faculty meetings. One misunderstanding, one misinterpreted gesture, and the school faces a lawsuit that could cost millions. The veteran teachers, those of us who'd been there for decades, understood what was really happening. Blackwell was preparing to sell the school to a corporate education company, and he needed to eliminate any potential legal problems that might affect the valuation. But the impact on education was devastating. How do you mentor a teenager without being able to show basic human warmth? How do you help a struggling student feel supported when every interaction has to be formal and documented? I watched my colleagues become more distant, more robotic. Teachers who used to stay after school to help students now sent them to the tutoring center. Educators who once offered shoulders to cry on now directed upset students to the guidance counselor's office. The students noticed. They started calling us teacher bots behind our backs. The warm, family-like atmosphere that had made Riverside special was replaced by something that felt more like a corporate training facility. Last month, we'd received the latest policy update, professional interaction guidelines, 12 pages of legal language that essentially made it clear that any deviation from prescribed protocols would result in immediate termination. No warnings, no second chances. Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught at Riverside for 38 years, resigned the day after that memo was distributed. During her farewell lunch, she said something that haunted me. They've sucked the humanity out of teaching. These kids need more than academic instruction. They need mentors, advocates, and sometimes just a caring adult who sees them as more than test scores. But I stayed. I loved my students too much to leave them in this increasingly cold environment. I thought I could find ways to support them within the new rules. I was naive. It was a Tuesday morning in March when my world collapsed. I was teaching my advanced placement literature class about the themes of loss and redemption in The Kite Runner when Emma Chun raised her hand with a question about the father-son relationships in the novel. Emma was one of my most thoughtful students, quiet but insightful, with essays that revealed a maturity beyond her 16 years. She was the daughter of Richard Chun, though I knew nothing about him beyond his name on emergency contact forms. Emma never talked about her family, and I respected her privacy. But that morning, something was different. Emma's usual composure was cracking. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hand shook as she took notes. When I called on her to share her thoughts about Amir's relationship with his father, her voice broke. "I'm sorry, Miss Thompson." And then she started crying. Not the quiet tears of teenage emotion, but the deep, racking sobs of someone whose world was falling apart. The class fell silent. 24 other students turned to look at Emma, whose shoulders shook as she tried to muffle her crying with her hands. In the old days before Blackwell's policies, this would have been simple. I would have quietly asked Emma to step into the hallway, given her a tissue and a moment to compose herself. Maybe even a supportive hug if she needed it. But under the new rules, I was supposed to call the guidance counselor and wait for them to handle the situation. I looked at Emma, this brilliant, sensitive girl who was clearly in pain, and I made a choice. "Class, please read chapter 15 silently while I step out for a moment," I said, walking over to Emma's desk. "Emma, would you like to get some fresh air?" She nodded, still sobbing, and followed me into the hallway. The corridor was empty, except for the distant sound of other classes in session. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked gently. "My mom," she whispered between sobs. "The doctors, they found more tumors. Stage 4. They're saying she might not." She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I understood. Without thinking, without considering policies or protocols or liability issues, I did what any caring human being would do. I opened my arms and let this devastated child lean against me while she cried for her dying mother. "It's going to be okay," I whispered, rubbing her back gently. "You're not alone in this." For 3 minutes, I held Emma while she sobbed. I didn't say much, just offered the silent comfort of someone who cared about her pain. When she finally pulled away, her eyes were clearer, and she managed a small smile. "Thank you, Miss Thompson. I needed that." Of course, I said. Do you want to go see Mrs. Rodriguez in guidance? She might be able to help you process this. Emma nodded and headed down the hallway. I returned to my classroom, where my students were pretending to read but were obviously concerned about their classmate. Is Emma okay? Asked Michael, one of my most empathetic students. She will be, I said. Sometimes life hits us hard, but we get through it with the support of people who care about us. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd done the right thing, shown compassion to a student in crisis. I was wrong. 3 hours later, I was called to Dr. Blackwell's office. Miss Thompson, we need to discuss a serious policy violation that occurred this morning. Dr. Blackwell sat behind his massive mahogany desk like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. His office smelled like expensive leather and air freshener, with diplomas and corporate awards covering the walls. Everything about the space was designed to intimidate. Sitting across from him was Mrs. Henderson, the head of human resources, with a legal pad and a tape recorder. This wasn't going to be a conversation, it was going to be a termination hearing. I'm not sure what you're referring to, I said, though my stomach was already sinking. Security footage shows you engaging in inappropriate physical contact with a student this morning, Blackwell said, sliding a manila folder across his desk. Specifically, you were recorded hugging Emma Chun in the hallway outside your classroom. I stared at the folder, not bothering to open it. Emma was crying because her mother is dying of cancer. I offered comfort to a devastated child. You violated clear school policy, Mrs. Henderson interjected, consulting her notes. The professional interaction guidelines explicitly state that any physical contact with students is grounds for immediate dismissal. Are you serious? I asked, feeling anger rising in my chest. A 16-year-old girl was sobbing about her mother's terminal illness, and you're concerned about a compassionate hug. We're concerned about liability, Blackwell said coldly. What if Emma, or her family, decides to claim that contact was inappropriate? What if other students say you show favoritism through physical affection? What if parents demand to know why their children don't receive the same level of attention? Then they'd be wrong, I said firmly. I've hugged hundreds of students over 22 years, boys and girls who needed comfort, support, or just acknowledgement that someone cared about them. Not one parent has ever complained because they understood it came from a place of genuine care. Times have changed, Mrs. Henderson said. Institutions can't afford to take risks based on good intentions. I looked at these two people, neither of whom had ever taught a class, never stayed late to help a struggling student, never attended a graduation to cheer for kids they'd watched grow up, and realized we were speaking different languages. They saw liability where I saw humanity. They saw risk where I saw compassion. They saw policy violations where I saw a teacher doing her job. So you're firing me? I said. It wasn't a question. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately, Blackwell confirmed. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay, and we'll provide a neutral reference confirming your dates of employment. What about my students? It's March. They're in the middle of preparing for AP exams. We'll find a substitute until we can hire a replacement. I thought about my AP literature students, who'd been working on their final projects, about my creative writing class, where several students were submitting pieces to national contests, about the drama club production of our town that I was directing, scheduled to open in 6 weeks. All of it would be handed over to strangers who didn't know these kids, didn't understand their goals and dreams, didn't care about their individual struggles and triumphs. This is wrong, I said quietly. This is necessary, Blackwell replied. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of wine and a pile of tissues, trying to process what had happened. 22 years of dedicated service, thousands of students whose lives I'd touched, countless hours of overtime without extra pay, all of it erased because I'd shown compassion to a grieving child. But I wasn't just angry. I was heartbroken. For Emma, who would return to school to find that the teacher who'd comforted her was gone. For my other students, who would learn that caring too much was dangerous. For the future teenagers who would attend Riverside and find themselves in an environment where humanity had been sacrificed for liability protection. I had no idea that Emma had gone home that day and told her father everything that had happened. The next few days passed in a blur of shock and grief. I'd been a teacher for so long that I didn't know who I was without a classroom. My days had been structured around lesson plans, grading, and student interactions. Suddenly, I had nothing but empty hours and a growing sense of injustice. Friends and colleagues reached out with sympathy and outrage. Many were afraid to speak publicly. They still had jobs at Riverside and couldn't risk their own positions but privately. They were furious. "You did what any decent human being would do," said Janet Morris, who taught chemistry and had been my friend for 15 years. "The fact that they fired you for it says everything about what this place has become." Former students started reaching out through social media. Word was spreading about what had happened, and the responses were overwhelming. Students from my early years, now adults with careers and families, shared stories about how my support had changed their lives. "Ms. Thompson, you hugged me when my dad left, and it was the first time I felt like someone cared," wrote Jessica Martinez, class of 2010. "That hug helped me believe I was worth something. How is that wrong? You stayed after school every day for 3 weeks to help me with my college essay," posted David Kim, class of 2015. "You believed in me when no one else did. You changed my life." The messages kept coming. Students who'd struggled with depression, family problems, academic challenges, all sharing how my willingness to see them as human beings, not just academic units, had made a difference. But support from former students, while emotionally healing, wasn't going to pay my bills or restore my career. At 45, I was facing the prospect of starting over in a profession that seemed to be moving further away from the values that had drawn me to teaching in the first place. I started researching other schools, updating my resume, and preparing for interviews where I'd have to explain why I'd been terminated. How do you tell potential employers that you were fired for showing compassion? How do you convince them that you're not a liability when your last job ended because you hugged a crying student? The job search was discouraging. Private schools wanted teachers who wouldn't create incidents. Public schools were dealing with their own zero-tolerance policies. Even substitute teaching positions seemed risky. What if I instinctively showed care to a student and faced another termination? 3 weeks after my firing, I was sitting at my kitchen table with job applications spread across the surface when my doorbell rang. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Standing on my front porch was a man in an expensive suit who looked vaguely familiar. Tall, well-groomed, with kind eyes that reminded me of someone I couldn't quite place. Miss Thompson? I'm Richard Chun, Emma's father. I was wondering if we could talk. Richard Chun wasn't what I'd expected from a Riverside parent. Despite his obviously expensive clothing and the Tesla parked in my driveway, there was a humility about him that was refreshing after years of dealing with entitled parents who viewed teachers as glorified babysitters. "Please, come in," I said, leading him to my living room. "How's Emma doing?" "That's actually why I'm here," he said, settling into the armchair across from my couch. "Emma told me what happened, both your kindness to her and the consequences you faced because of it." I felt a pang of worry. I hope she doesn't blame herself for my termination. What happened wasn't her fault. "She doesn't blame herself," Richard said quietly. "She blames the school. And frankly, so do I." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be news articles. "Ms. Thompson, I've spent the past 3 weeks researching you. I've read every article about your teaching awards, every recommendation letter you've written that's available through public records, and every social media post from former students singing your praises." I wasn't sure where this was going, but his tone was serious. "I've also been investigating Riverside Preparatory Academy," he continued. "Did you know that Dr. Blackwell has fired 6 teachers in the past 2 years for similar policy violations? A chemistry teacher who stayed late to tutor a struggling student without proper supervision. A history teacher who drove a student home when their ride didn't show up. An art teacher who provided supplies to students who couldn't afford them." I hadn't known about the others, but it didn't surprise me. The policies were so rigid that any act of genuine care could be twisted into a violation. "The pattern suggests this isn't about student safety," Richard said. "It's about eliminating dedicated teachers who might object to the school's transformation into a corporate education factory." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Richard set down his tablet and looked directly at me. "Because Emma came home that day and told me that the most caring teacher she'd ever had was fired for showing her compassion when she needed it most. And because I believe teachers like you are exactly what education needs more of, not less. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Ms. Thompson, I'd like to offer you a job. I blinked, not sure I'd heard correctly. Sorry. I run a foundation that supports innovative education initiatives, Richard explained. We're launching a new project at school for gifted students from underserved communities. We need someone to develop the English curriculum and serve as the department head. That's very generous, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for curriculum development on that scale. Richard smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Ms. Thompson, you've been developing curriculum for 22 years. Every lesson plan you've created, every way you've adapted your teaching to reach different learning styles, every innovative project you've designed, that's curriculum development. He pulled out another tablet, this one showing architectural plans and photos. The Chun Foundation Academy will serve 200 students in grades 9 through 12. Full scholarships for students who demonstrate academic potential but lack resources. Small class sizes, innovative teaching methods, and a philosophy that puts student well-being at the center of education. You're talking about starting a school? I'm talking about starting a revolution, Reacher said, his eyes lighting up with passion. Education that treats students as whole human beings, not test-taking machines. Teachers who are trusted to use their professional judgment instead of following rigid protocols. A place where a hug for a crying student is seen as good teaching, not a liability. I stared at the plans on his tablet. The school looked like a dream: modern facilities, outdoor learning spaces, technology labs, and art studios. Everything that public schools desperately needed but couldn't afford. Why me? I asked. You could hire anyone with this kind of funding, because 3 weeks ago you risked your career to comfort my daughter when she was in pain, Richard said simply. Because hundreds of former students consider you a life-changing influence. Because you've spent 22 years proving that great teaching comes from the heart, not from policy manuals. He leaned forward, his expression intense but kind. Ms. Thompson, I've made my fortune in technology, but I've always believed that education is the greatest investment we can make in the future. When I saw what happened to UN, I realized that our current system punishes exactly the kind of teacher we need more of. Decided it was time to do something about it. What kind of salary are we talking about? I asked, barely believing this conversation was real. 90,000 to start, with performance bonuses and full benefits. Professional development budget of 10,000 annually. Sabbatical opportunities every 7 years. And complete autonomy to design your program as you see fit. I nearly choked. That was 40,000 more than I'd been making at Riverside. There's one more thing, Richard said, pulling out a final document. I've been in touch with 6 other teachers who were fired from various schools for similar violations of corporate policies. All excellent educators who put students first. I'd like you to help me recruit them to join our faculty. I looked at the names on the list. I recognized several of them teachers whose dismissals had made local news, educators who'd been terminated for showing basic human decency. You want to hire teachers who've been fired? I want to hire teachers who've proven they care more about students than they do about protecting themselves, Richard said. Teachers who understand that education is about building relationships, not just delivering content. 6 months later, I stood in my new classroom at Chun Foundation Academy, watching my students work on their first major creative writing project. The walls were covered with student work, motivational quotes, and photos from our outdoor literature discussions. Through the large windows, I could see other classes engaged in collaborative learning projects, science experiments, and artistic endeavors. Everything about this place was different from Riverside. Class sizes were capped at 16 students. Teachers were trusted to use professional judgment. Students called us by our first names and were encouraged to see us as mentors and advocates, not just instructors. Most importantly, when students needed support, academic or emotional, we were empowered to provide it. Just last week, Marcus Williams, a brilliant 16-year-old from the inner city, had broken down in my class while reading his essay about growing up without a father. When he started crying, I didn't hesitate to put my hand on his shoulder and tell him how proud I was of his courage in sharing his story. No policies were violated. No administrators questioned my judgment. I was simply allowed to be a teacher in the fullest sense of the word. Emma Chun had transferred to our school for her senior year, and watching her thrive in an environment that valued her as a whole person was incredibly rewarding. Her mother's cancer was in remission, and Emma was planning to study education in college. "I want to be a teacher like you," she told me after class one day, "someone who sees students as human beings, not potential lawsuits." The other teachers Richard had recruited were flourishing as well. Mrs. Pedersen, the veteran teacher who'd resigned from Riverside, was now directing our innovative interdisciplinary program. Dr. James Miller, fired from a public school for spending his own money on student supplies, was heading our science department and conducting groundbreaking research on student-centered learning. But the most satisfying part wasn't our success, it was the ripple effect we were creating. Other schools were starting to question their own rigid policies. Parents were demanding more humane treatment of teachers and students. Education reporters were writing articles about our approach, and foundations were reaching out about replicating our model. 3 months ago, I received a letter that made everything worthwhile. It was from Dr. Blackwell at Riverside Preparatory Academy. "Dear Ms. Thompson," it began, "we are writing to invite you to return to Riverside as our new academic dean. We have reconsidered our interaction policies and would value your input on creating a more student-centered environment." I read the letter twice, then filed it in my trash can. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. Today, Chun Foundation Academy is in its second year, and we have a waiting list of over 800 students. Our first graduating class was accepted to colleges at a rate of 98%, with over $2 million in scholarship offers. But more than statistics, we've proven that education works best when teachers are trusted to care about their students as human beings. Richard Chun's investment in education has grown beyond our single school. The Chun Foundation now supports teacher advocacy programs, funds research on humane educational practices, and provides legal assistance to educators who face termination for showing basic compassion. Last month, a chemistry teacher in Texas was fired for hugging a student who'd lost a parent in a car accident. The Chun Foundation covered her legal fees, and she's now teaching at one of our partner schools in Austin. Every teacher who loses their job for caring about students is a tragedy for education, Richard told me recently. But every teacher we save and support is a victory for thousands of future students. If you're an educator reading this, I want you to know that you're not alone in feeling frustrated by systems that punish compassion and reward compliance. There are people fighting to change these policies, to restore humanity to education, and to support teachers who put students first. Document everything. Build relationships with parents who value your dedication. Connect with colleagues who share your commitment to student well-being. And remember that sometimes the most powerful change comes from the most unexpected allies. For administrators who might be listening, consider this: the policies you implement in the name of liability protection might be protecting you from lawsuits, but they're also protecting you from excellence. Great teaching requires relationships, trust, and the freedom to respond to students as unique individuals with complex needs. When you fire teachers for showing compassion, you're sending a message that caring about students is dangerous. When you prioritize legal protection over educational effectiveness, you're creating institutions that serve lawyers better than they serve children. The students in our classrooms deserve teachers who see them as more than academic units or potential risks. They deserve educators who understand that learning happens best in environments where young people feel valued, supported, and genuinely cared for. Because sometimes the hug that gets you fired is the same hug that saves a student's life. Sometimes the policy violation that ends your career is actually the moment when you do your most important work as an educator. And sometimes, just sometimes, there is a parent watching who understands the difference between liability and humanity and who has the power to create something better. Emma Chun is now a freshman at Stanford University, studying education and policy. She wants to become a teacher, and she wants to work in schools where compassion isn't a fireable offense. The future of education depends on people like Emma, like Richard Chu, and like every teacher who refuses to let policy manuals replace their professional judgment and human hearts. Because in the end, education isn't about protecting institutions from risk. It's about preparing young people for life. And life, as any good teacher knows, requires both excellent instruction and genuine human connection.